All right, we're about to take a trip way back in time. We're going to uncover a pretty surprising truth. The study of language, it didn't start with people trying to communicate better. Nope. It all began with philosophers, priests, and poets who were asking some really big questions.
So, let me start by asking you this. Who actually taught you grammar? For most of us, right, it was probably a teacher in a classroom. There were textbooks, rules about nouns and verbs, the whole deal. But think about it. People were speaking and telling stories for thousands of years before anyone ever wrote a grammar book. So, what was the point of inventing grammar in the first place?
And here's the answer, and it's probably not what you'd expect. The study of grammar didn't start to help us chat more clearly at the market. It began as a way to preserve sacred texts perfectly, to win philosophical debates, and to try and force a kind of logical order onto the messiness of the world. It was all about finding the one true way to speak.
So let's dive into this very earliest stage. Academics sometimes call it the pre-structural period, but a much better name for it is atomism. And that name, atomism, it gives us a huge clue about how these first thinkers looked at language.
You know how an atom is the smallest possible building block of matter? Well, that's exactly the idea here. These early scholars believed that to understand language, you had to smash it into its smallest pieces. They'd look at individual words, single sounds, letters on a page, all in total isolation, trying to figure out what each tiny part meant on its own.
Here's a good way to think about it. Imagine you completely dismantle a car. You lay out every single piece on the garage floor. The wheels, the engine block, every last nut and bolt. You could study each part in incredible detail, right? But you'd have absolutely no idea how they all work together to make the car actually go. That was the atomist approach. It was all about the individual parts, not the system that made them run.
And the first big arena for all this was ancient Greece. The Greeks were, let's just say, very proud of their language. They thought it was pure, logical, the perfect tool for philosophy. And this pride led them to a huge, fascinating debate.
This was the central question that split the greatest minds of the time. Is there some kind of inherent, almost magical connection between a word like tree and the actual thing it describes? Or are words just random labels that we, as humans, have all just agreed to use? This wasn't just some dusty academic argument. It was a battle for the very soul of language.
And this whole disagreement was perfectly captured by a teacher and his most famous student. On one side, you have Plato. He led a group called the Naturalists, and he believed language was a reflection of some perfect, divine reality. For him, the word circle is tied to the ideal form of a perfect circle that exists somewhere out there. But then his own student, Aristotle, comes along and says, hang on a second. He argued that language is just a practical tool, a human invention. I mean, the fact that we say dog and the French say chien proves his point, right? It's just a convention, an agreement, not some natural law. Now, get this. At the exact same time the Greeks were lost in these deep philosophical debates, a completely different approach was taking shape all the way over in ancient India. And their focus wasn't on logic or ideas at all.
And this is the crucial difference. The focus in India wasn't on dusty old written texts or abstract philosophy. It was on the physical, spoken reality of language. They were obsessed with the science of sound itself, and they reached a level of precision that was literally centuries ahead of its time.
So why the different focus? Well, it was all driven by religion. Their sacred hymns, the Vedas, were considered the literal words of the gods. Mispronouncing even a syllable was a huge deal. This pushed scholars like Panini, who many call the world's first true linguist, to create this incredibly detailed grammar of Sanskrit. He came up with over 4,000 rules describing the language's phonetics with almost mathematical precision. And here's the most important part. His approach was descriptive. He was describing how the language was actually used, not telling people how they should use it. A huge difference.
Okay, let's fast forward a bit. For centuries after the Greeks and Romans, language study kind of chugged along, mostly tied to translating religious texts. But the next huge leap forward didn't happen until the 1700s and 1800s. That's when scholars started looking at languages not just by themselves, but next to each other. And they stumbled onto something amazing. They started doing this new thing, laying out word lists side by side, from languages all across Europe and even as far away as India. And as they did this, a really stunning pattern started to pop out. The words for the most basic things, family members, numbers, nature, they weren't just a little bit similar. They were clearly systematically related.
I mean, just look at this. You've got mother in English, mère in French, mater in Latin, and matar in ancient Sanskrit. Or look at three, toi, tres, tres.
The family resemblance is just undeniable. There's no way this could be a coincidence.
This was a total game changer. It gave birth to a whole new field called comparative philology. Scholars finally understood that languages, just like people, have ancestors. English, French, Latin, and Sanskrit didn't just borrow words from each other. No, they were all descendants of a common ancestor, a mother tongue we now call Proto-Indo-European. They were all part of one huge family tree.
Okay, so that was a cool history lesson, but you might be thinking, why does any of this ancient stuff matter to me today? Well, the echoes of these very first thinkers are still with us. In fact, they're probably hiding in the grammar rules you were forced to learn in school. Come on, how many of us have heard this one? It's a classic. It gets drilled into our heads. Don't say, "Who are you talking to?" You should say, "To whom are you talking?" It sounds all formal and correct, maybe a little stuffy, but have you ever wondered where that rule actually came from?
Well, it turns out this rule is a ghost from the ancient Roman prescriptive approach. See, early grammarians decided that Latin was the perfect language, and they tried to force English to follow its rules. In Latin, it's structurally impossible to end a sentence with a preposition. But English isn't Latin. It's perfectly natural for us. So that rule you learned, it isn't about being clear. It's a 2,000-year-old attempt to make one language behave like a completely different one.
So let's do a quick recap of this whole journey. We started with the Greeks, who were all about written language and logical purity. Then we jumped over to the Indian school, which was focused on the spoken word for religious precision. The Romans came along and basically adapted the Greek ideas to create a practical system for education. And finally, comparative philology gave us the big picture, a historical view that uncovered the deep family connections between languages. 4 different schools, 4 totally different goals, all laying the groundwork for what we now call linguistics.
And that leaves us with one last big thought to chew on. The study of grammar didn't begin because people wanted to understand each other better. It started because they wanted control. Control over sacred texts, control over philosophical truth, and sometimes control over other cultures. It's a powerful reminder that the rules of our language, they've never really just been about being correct. They've always, in some way, been about power.